Hello AS, although not for much longer. Welcome to the first activity we're going to look at to do with bridging. We're going to look at two, hopefully three topics within bridging that you will need to know for research methods for next year. And these, if you do them now, you understand them now, you remember them now, commit them to memory, will make your life much easier in September, because we'll only need a couple of lessons of research methods rather than the whole term previously all the way up until Christmas. So it's definitely worth your time. So we do add a little bit more research methods on next year, but only a couple of weeks, about 3 or 4 weeks before we move on to biopsychology. Today we're going to look at content analysis, and I'm going to set you a summer task, and I'll share that information with you in another video and in class. And it's to do content analysis, and the reason that we've done this is so people remember content analysis, because I find that students very easily forget this one, a little bit like correlational studies, so it's a vital one. Please commit it to memory, because a whole chunk of your paper 2 research methods could be on content analysis. Okay, here is the definition of content analysis as taken from the mark scheme. So content analysis is a technique for analysing qualitative data. So if you're using qualitative data, you will be doing a content analysis. And then there are two different types of content analysis. There is coding, which takes qualitative data and turns it into categories so that it can be counted, and I'll just quickly show you an example there. So if there's a qualitative data and you've got to bear in mind it's qualitative, so if there was a script, a transcript or an interview of lots of different people who were asked what their favourite part of Christmas was, and they just talked freely about Christmas. Every time decorating the tree was mentioned, you'd tally it. Every time opening a present was mentioned, you would tally it. So you would take that information from qualitative into tallied, counted numbers. Okay, and then thematic is where qualitative data is analysed and placed into themes, so remains more qualitative, still qualitative, but it's summarised. An example here would be a real piece of research that's been conducted about people who couples where one of the couples has gone through the process of transition, and the themes, they've had discussions with those people and then those couples, and then the themes that have developed from the conversations that they've had. So interpersonal, well, you can see them all there, I'm not going to read them out to you, and there's also a link in the corner. It's a really interesting piece of research where they qualitative data, they have a transcript of discussion that they've had with lots of different couples, and then that's identified into there are certain themes that emerge consistently, so it's still qualitative rather than quantitative. So, qualitative to coding, the step-by-step process. First, you would choose what you are going to pick your sample. So, is that going to be newspaper articles from The Guardian using the search term Brexit, for example, or is it going to be transcripts from interviews with coal miners from Nottingham, or anything at all? You select your sample. So that doesn't mean your people, it means the sample of qualitative data that you are going to collect. And then you go through a pilot study where you familiarise yourselves with the materials. So much like a pilot study where you conduct a small experiment on a small amount of the participants, here it's a small section of the articles. And then you go through the process of coding. So you identify categories that come up. So you read through that small section and you identify categories that keep coming up. So use of Brexit terminology, for example, and you would decide what that was. You would have a list. When they use a quote from a politician, when they make some reference to fake news, or when they refer to a hard or a soft Brexit. And then you would tally that. So every time those codes happened, you would then read through the whole sample rather than just a small sample, and you would tally that, and you would conduct statistical analysis. And in this case, it would be the sign test because it's nominal data. And I'm trying to think else. We can talk about that one. You'll see that's one of the lessons that we look at after summer as well. And we're looking for a difference, so we could talk about it like that. So you collect your sample, you familiarise yourself with a small amount, you identify codes from that small amount of data, and then you tally looking at the whole of the sample and analyse it, conduct statistical analysis and draw conclusions. Activity in your book, I would like you to pick one of the aims below and apply the process of the stages, so pilot, sample, sample, pilot, coding, tally and analysis. So this is practicing your application skills. So to investigate how different genders are portrayed in adverts, you can choose whatever you want, however you want. Just remember to be specific. Imagine you were going to give this to me, could I replicate it? And to investigate how men and women use different language in dating profiles. Again, be specific. Specifically, because this is an exam, you'll have to be asked to do an exam question in class, make sure you name the coding categories. And exactly like behavioural categories in observations, make sure they're operationalised, so they're clear, they're specific, and they are contextualised. They are actually linked to what you are looking at. And then there's data, which is thematic analysis, which takes qualitative data, continues to hold it as qualitative data, but summarises it more. It allows you to draw conclusions. So the structure is roughly the same. Sample, you would pick your sample. This is a piece of research that was conducted, so they collected tweets in the in those 2 dates. So on that day, essentially from midnight of that day till midnight, so all the way through, with the hashtag Dear Mental Health Professional. Then they conducted a pilot, so they familiarised themselves with the material, so they read through a small selection of the tweets. They developed coding categories and then identified themes from that category, those categories. So there's an element of quantitative because there is some coding involved. However, ultimately it says in the mark scheme that thematic is it's qualitative data to qualitative data. And your example there, you've got wanting a diagnosis, feeling a diagnosis would be useful, feeling relief at a diagnosis, or feeling frustration at a lack of diagnosis. They're all codes that you would identify, and from that you would identify an emergent theme would be the impact or the importance of a diagnosis, and that would be one of the themes. So this was a piece of research that was conducted, and exactly as it was seen here, one of the themes they identified was the impact of diagnosis on personal identity as a facilitator for accessing care. So they would talk about the fact that was one of the themes that was identified. And then there's some examples of the themes as well, and some of the tweets that were used and identified. Again, a really interesting piece of research that you can have a look at. So, same thing again, activity 2, pick one of the aims below, and this time conduct some thematic content analysis on either how newspapers report on mental health or how people express their views about immigration on Facebook and Twitter, or about immigrants on Facebook and Twitter. Now, you don't have to conduct these at all, you just need to tell me the step-by-step process. Okay, and have a think about some of the some of the coding categories or the themes that you might expect to emerge. Okay, and then as always you need evaluations of the content analysis. So if you'd like to pick these, and the most important thing what I want you to do with them is I want you to structure them into that P structure. That P structure doesn't go away, it becomes even more important in the second year. So you've got strengths. A strength of it is that it's information from genuine real life sources. Think back to the 2 pieces of research that I've referred you to. It's newspaper articles from The Guardian was one. Discussions with people where one of the couple is transitioning from, I think it was from male to female for all of the couples. Tweets, so they were all genuine real life sources, nothing artificial about them. It's very, very easy to replicate. Those newspaper articles that you read and conducted some analysis on, you can pass them to somebody else to conduct analysis on them. You can conduct a second analysis on them. So once you've collected the data, if you record everything accurately, it is very easy to replicate. What is that a strength? Why is that a strength? Word that very carefully. Think carefully because we've talked about that. And then circumnavigates gets around ethical issues. So we're not actually, if it's an experimental design, then we would have to, experimental method, apologies, like a lab study, we would have to say, we'd have to randomly allocate people and say, right, you will transition from male to female, which of course isn't very ethical, or there's an example later on that is a case study rather than content analysis, but the same idea still stands. So people discussing their experiences of child abuse, we wouldn't be able to create an environment that allowed children to experience child abuse and then judge and then collect data on it. However, we can interview them and then conduct content analysis on that qualitative information. So that allows us to do that, a bit like when we talked about correlations as well. So I use the example of smoking and the incidence of cancer. Now, of course, that wouldn't be content analysis because it's quantitative data. But it's the same idea. It circumnavigates ethical issues. Why is that a good thing? And then a weakness is obviously that it's subjective, particularly thematic, but content analysis as well. They are both very subjective. They are people's opinions of what themes are being identified, or interpretations of how the coding categories. So one person could argue that one of the tweets was about the positive impact of a diagnosis, while another person could argue that tweet was about a reflection on diagnosis as a label. So you could interpret, one person could interpret it one way and one the other. So it's very, very subjective, and the information can be taken out of context. So for both of those, why are those problems? If someone was being sarcastic, there are some examples in the hashtag Dear Mental Health Professional where people are being very, very sarcastic. So if you took it out of context, you might not realise they were being sarcastic, and therefore your data would lack accuracy. So think carefully about the words you would use for that one as well. So there you go, there's your evaluation for content analysis. Case studies, dead easy. We've looked at case studies already. The only time you would ever call something a case study is when it meets the criteria I'm just about to discuss. Please do not, because Andy and I find it incredibly frustrating. It is not psychologically good practice to do. Please do not call things like experiments case studies, or anything like that. So you've only learnt a very small number of case studies in memory, such as the FK and somebody else, because they meet this criteria. Badley's research is not a case study, so do only use the term case study when it meets these criteria, which are that it's a very, very in-depth study of one person or a small group of people over time, and that again, that's taken directly from the mark scheme. So if you become familiar with those concepts, then you are within the mark scheme. It's usually carried out in the real world, and they are very idiographic and individualistic. Idiographic is a new term that you will look at in A2 to do with research issues and debates. Idiographic just means individual. It collects a lot, exactly as it said there, it collects a lot of in-depth data that's relevant to the individual, unlike things like the behaviourist approach with classical conditioning or operant conditioning or social learning theory, or the biological approach. An idiographic approach does not look at developing general laws. So if it talks about being an idiographic approach, then it is generally they've used case studies to collect their data. Idio means individual. Okay, and there are some examples of some case studies. So HM is one you're already familiar with. Little Hands is one we're going to look at with Freud. Fascinating, if slightly bizarre example, so I'd encourage you to look at that because we look at Freud as one of the approaches in A2. Phineas Gage, again, he is someone that we've briefly touched on, and he will be very relevant when we start to look at localization and lateralization in the second year. And finally, Jeannie. So when I referred to an example of child abuse, Jeannie is a very extreme case of some horrific child abuse. If you want to, these links can be found in the comment section. If you'd like to have a look at those, then you can do. And I think if you just check in your booklet, I think you are asked to pick one of those and explain why it is a case study. Let's just have a quick look at your flipped learning booklet. Apologies. Yes, there we go. So watch one of the videos, make some brief notes. You can watch as many as you want, they're really interesting, and then pick one. If you don't feel comfortable with the idea of, or you find it quite challenging to listen to child abuse, then don't pick Jeannie's example. Phineas Gage is fine, you're aware of Phineas Gage already. Little Hands, bit weird, and HM1, you know from memory. That is it. Case studies, that is the only time you'd ever refer to a case study, nice and simple. And then evaluations of case studies. In your booklet you have the starting sentence for the evaluation of a case study. I would like you to use all of these terms in at least, so not all of them in one evaluation point, but by the time you've extended all of those evaluation points in your booklet, you will have used all of this terminology. And if you used it more than once in each evaluation point, that is really, really good. Terminology and depth and extended evaluation points are absolutely key at A2. Just remember, it's not an experiment, so just be careful of the language you use. Are there certain types of validity that are only really appropriate to an experiment? Remember to call it what it is, a case study. Okay, so just be careful with that one. Excellent. That is it for case studies and content analysis. Complete the work and I will see you in class.